Now in this video of Theaetetus 148e to 151d, I want to talk about the midwife discussion. It's a bit of a controversy in the literature as to whether or not this discussion of 148e to 151d, the midwife discussion, whether Plato is having Socrates really talk about the doctrine of anamnesis, which is a metaphysical epistemological doctrine, or if we should really think of this discussion as just kind of an illustration of Socrates' general methodology. Of course, there's nothing preventing us from considering it as both, which is what I'm sympathetic to, that there's more than one level going on here. But we'll have a look at it and see if we could tease out just what this is all about. Now, as I said, this section is the midwife story, discussion. It's an analogy. Aside from, let's say, Plato's discussion of the cave in the Republic, which I would say is arguably one of his most famous discussions, this image of Socrates as a kind of midwife, remember it's an analogy, is clearly one of Plato's most famous images, or it's right up there with the Republic and the notion of the cave. Now, before I dig into this, I want to make one comment on the notion of an analogy. As I said, Socrates is drawing an analogy. He's making an analogy between himself and that of a midwife. Now, Socrates was the son of a stonecutter, and his dad was a stonecutter, and his mom was a midwife, Phina Arete, which is roughly could be translated, that's her name, that could be translated as one who brings forth virtue. So maybe that's true. I'm not sure. But nonetheless, he makes a lot out of the fact that his mom was a midwife and that he, too, is a kind of, shall we say, intellectual or philosophical midwife. And we'll unpack a little bit of what that means. But again, as I said, it is an analogy, so we should think of a few things about analogies before we get started to keep things in perspective. So, little note on analogies. If we say, in general, that some x is analogous to y, and it doesn't matter what x and y are. We're just calling them analogous, or there is an analogy between x and y. What we're just saying is that there are some commonalities and some differences. So, the analogy is not an identity. So that's something to get very clear on. Is the analogies are not identities. In other words, there has to be some differences between the two. If you say x is analogous to y and all they have are commonalities and there's no difference, well then you're asserting an identity. So that's an important thing to think about, is that all analogies break down somewhere. In other words, to have two things in a relationship that we would say is an analogy, you are saying, yeah, at some point or in some sense they do differ. But what we're concentrating on with the analogy is in what sense they are the same. So analogies are not identities. Second point I want to make is that analogies are not arguments. Analogies are using one thing to say it's got something in common with another, to more or less ignore the differences, but using one thing to understand another. So you could draw an analogy, let's say, between, I don't know, something like horses and unicorns. Well, if we say a horse is analogous to a unicorn, or horses and unicorns are analogous, what are some commonalities? Well, their body structure and all that. What are some differences? Well, first off, horses don't have horns on their heads. That's what unicorns have. But when I say it's not an argument, you wouldn't say something like, well, we know that horses exist and they're analogous to unicorns, so unicorns must exist. That's a wrong way to interpret and think about analogies. Analogies are just helpful ways of understanding things maybe a little less familiar, like a unicorn, on the basis of things that are more familiar, like horses. So keep in mind what analogies are supposed to be up to here. And so that'll help to make more sense when Socrates says, well, in one way I'm like a midwife and in another way I'm not. Hence the notion of an analogy. All right, back to the Theaetetus. After the big intro to the dialogue, all the discussions about definitions, all that stuff about mathematics and lines and roots and powers and all those things, Theaetetus says, you know, Socrates, at the end of it all, what you're worried about, the notion of defining terms, you're worried about defining episteme. Remember, don't get lost. That's shall we say, in the forest, keep sight of the trees. We're trying to figure out what episteme is, what knowledge is, what's the definition of it. And Theaetetus says, yeah, I've been worried about this. I've worried about these kinds of things like definitions and precisions of terms because, being a student of mathematics, a bit of a prodigy, right? Theodorus has instilled this, no doubt, and various mathematicians have worried about these kinds of things. But Theaetetus says, I have been worried about this and I keep thinking about it. It kind of keeps, sort of, shall we say, it just keeps going around and around in my mind. And Socrates says, well, and here's the beginning of the analogy with the midwife. Socrates says, well, that kind of worrying, that indicates that your mind is fertile, that your mind is not barren, your mind is pregnant. So right away we have this sort of constant worrying. He's drawing an analogy with it to kind of like labor pains. So you're fertile. Your mind is kind of pregnant with ideas, and if you consider the analogy as well, and certainly back then they didn't have ultrasounds and things like that, so they didn't really know what was going on in the womb all that well. Midwives, if anyone, had some knowledge of what was going on, but it's not perfectly clear knowledge. So the analogy is that sort of the uncertainty or some of the difficulties associated with labor pains, that's like worrying. It's going on. Your mind is active, just like a woman's body is active when she's pregnant. So there's your analogy, and it's up and running. So then, yes, Socrates goes and talks about, have you heard the story of my mom, the midwife? And Theaetetus says, yes. And so Theaetetus, his admission shows that, yeah, it was, at least Plato's trying to get this across to us. Remember, Plato's the author of this dialogue. That Socrates' behavior was known. His midwife, descendant of a midwife story, was known. And then Socrates says, perhaps you've seen me behaving a little oddly. And Theaetetus goes, yeah, you're well known for being a little bit odd. And Socrates says, well, I'm going to give you an illustration of why I'm kind of odd. And then in that sense, we can see that the analogy between himself and that of a midwife is going to give some kind of explanation as to why he behaves oddly. All right, Socrates says that, think about a midwife. Midwives in general in Greece, those were the people that handled the birthing process. It wasn't really medicalized, so you got to be historically sensitive as to who was involved in this, and they were women, and these tended to be women, Socrates says, that had already had children, and they were beyond their child-rearing years. So they'd had their kids are grown up, and then they became midwives. Or at least that they weren't in the process of themselves being pregnant and having children. They'd gone through that, and they were helping other women to go through their pregnancies and deliver their children. So a midwife is a woman who's had experience giving birth, but no longer of child-bearing years. A midwife is kind of like the goddess Artemis, and again, I'm always sensitive that when Plato brings in these things, they're just not ornamental. It's important as to why he brings in the notion of a goddess here. But he says the midwives are kind of like Artemis, who is a goddess that doesn't have children. In fact, Artemis is known as a virgin goddess. So so the family stuff, she's not really connected to that, but yet she's representative or a key figure for midwives. And so this is interesting. So why would that be brought in? There seems to be some sort of disconnect here, that you would have the physical aspect, the physical women who they've had children, okay, so through their experience of that, they can then take that knowledge that they acquire through experience, because Socrates says, the human nature it is kind of too weak to have knowledge without experience. So he seems to tie knowledge to experience in the midwife case. So that's why the women who've had children would make good midwives. But Artemis is the sort of the goddess of midwives, and she's a virgin, so she has no experience with giving birth and all that stuff. So why would she be brought in as this kind of image? So it could be that Socrates is saying, well, look, the goddess can be knowledgeable without experience and by experience I mean like everyday ordinary experience, like physical experience. So there is some kind of suggestion here that perhaps knowledge is not completely linked to experience. That's an important thing to keep in mind. So this could be seen as an element of foreshadowing, to getting you as the reader. Remember, we're watching this play. Remember, we're sitting there with Euclides and Terpsion listening to this great dialogue. And perhaps what Socrates is introducing is this notion that experience and knowledge are not absolutely linked. Maybe they could be broken apart a bit. Maybe experience might be maybe a necessary condition, maybe it's a sufficient condition, or maybe it's irrelevant, or at least there could be some conceptual distinction to be thought about. And that opens up the discussion of what knowledge is. What concepts should we link knowledge to? And we'll see later, in later videos, that trying to link knowledge to certain concepts is going to run into a lot of trouble. So there's a lot packed into this little bit of imagery of the notion of Artemis, who is without experience but having knowledge. And it's to get us to start separating our concepts, which is the basis of analysis, is pulling things apart. And it's thinking that there might be separations when other people thought there were unities. All right, so that might be a little hint of the dialogue's direction, and to get us sort of like a bit of a primer, get us, sort of an intuition pump, getting you to think of, oh, okay, maybe that's forthcoming. So Socrates now enters into the discussion, and he's comparing and contrasting himself. So he's fleshing out this analogy between himself and the midwife. So he claims to be giving birth to ideas, as the midwife does with giving birth to children, helping women give birth to children. And of course, remember, he is always stressing that he himself doesn't have ideas, right? So like the midwife at the particular point in time, she's not pregnant, she's helping another in a birthing process. He's not pregnant with any ideas, he's just helping another in the birth of an idea, all right? So it plays no role in how the idea got there, and midwives play no role in conception or anything like that, so there's this structural analogy. All right, so in 149c to pretty well the end of this section, there is this analogy between midwives and philosophers, but primarily Socrates as the teacher. All right, so there's a number like this. There's commonalities or similarities, and then your dissimilarities, your differences. So it's an analogy. So we'll go through that, and then I'll make a few comments on this whole sort of idea of the philosopher midwife thing that Socrates is promoting. Okay, so some similarities. Well, and you can read through it and you might be able to tease out a little bit more, or you can compress these, but these are just sort of a general overall. Midwives don't give birth, right? They've done it, but they're not doing it as midwives. And Socrates, he has no wisdom. So Socrates, it's not that he has no knowledge or wisdom at all, but if he does, it's not what's going on there. Socrates is trying to bring something out of the student, not trying to put something in, and not trying to influence the student except in a direction towards truth. The midwife doesn't give birth, has no role in the conception, is just trying to bring out what's inside, namely to help birth a child. Midwives are also good at, they're the ones with the kind of knowledge of knowing who is pregnant, right? Midwives are able to figure that out through their experience working with women. They can tell, so more or less like in early stages, right? Before most of us would be able to recognize when someone's pregnant, a midwife would know earlier on, would be able to recognize certain kinds of signs and maybe be a good predictor or whatnot. So they have more familiarity with what eventually is going to be the case and who is going to give birth. Socrates, in his way, He knows who has good ideas, so he can recognize good and bad students. Right? Midwives use spells and incantations and all kinds of things. And why do they do that? Well, they know how to induce labor. So if a woman's overdue or any of these kinds of things, midwives know what to do to get the process rolling. Again, they play no role in the origins, in conception or anything like that, but they're the ones that say, hey, maybe things aren't going as well as they should. I know what to do to help foster and bring the child along and get the process, that is, induce labor, get things going. Socrates also does this in his way, but he doesn't use spells and incantations in that sense. He uses his words, arguments, language to try and bring out what's in the mind of the student. Midwives are good at knowing matchmakers, how to put people together to producing good offspring, and that kind of like who's going to work with whom and whatnot. So they have experience in that, and they would be good at that. Socrates is also, and this is an important educational point, is not just, education isn't just, trying to get ideas out of people. It certainly isn't trying to put ideas in people, but it's also recognizing the conditions under which certain individuals would be more likely to give birth, right, in scare quotes, to give birth to their good ideas, and those conditions would be, you need a proper a teacher, not just a good teacher in terms of just sort of a general category of good teacher, but to recognize that someone could be a good student and somebody a good teacher, but they may not be a good match, right? So same thing here. Some people might be, able to be in good relationships and have children and all that, but not everybody is a good match with everybody. So same thing pedagogically and education-wise. There's no one, put it this way, there's no one way to be a good teacher. There's no one way to be a good student. You have to recognize that there can be different species of good students, different species of good teachers. Socrates, like a midwife, would be good at recognizing, oh, I'm going to pair these and we'll get good results. I'll pair those and get good results. But this good student and that good teacher, that could lead to a bad result. I won't pair them. Midwives may cause abortions. If a midwife determines that something's going wrong in the pregnancy, that, we're going to have trouble here, or for whatever reason, midwives would make those kinds of judgments. They would be the best to make those judgments. They may cause an abortion. Socrates, too, would say, oh, this thinking is going awry. This isn't a good idea that's taking shape. And Socrates would likewise take away bad ideas. So there is this sort of analogy of abortion in the physical sense and abortion in terms of getting rid of bad ideas. Well, Socrates then says, of course, midwives are not always, but sometimes resented. And Socrates, too, is resented. Why? Well, midwives may be resented by taking away or causing an abortion. Or in those days, they also would take away the child that's born, but that's maybe too weak to survive, or they would make those kinds of judgments, ones that might horrify us today, but different society at a different time. They may say, well, this child can't survive, so we're going to leave it to die of exposure or something like that. And midwives are not going to be very popular when they make those kinds of judgments. So people would be, families and women would be very upset with them for doing that, but the midwife would make the argument, has to be done. Socrates, too, says people will definitely resent me for what I'm doing by taking away bad ideas. Now, think of this is a big one here, because right now we're on the edge of Socrates going to trial, and how he was deeply resented, and he too is going to suffer because of taking away bad ideas, behaving like a philosophical midwife. Now, at the end of it, there's a warning. If you ignore your midwife, if you're pregnant and your midwife is telling you to eat certain foods or not do certain things or do certain things, you ignore your midwife at your own peril. If your midwife says you should give up that newborn, it's not going to survive or whatever, in the long run it's a better thing, Midwives would, this didn't work. I'm going to take this particular offspring away. You try again, whatever. If you ignore that, you're going to get into some kind of trouble. You're down the line eventually. Maybe the child will only live a year or something like that. Again, pretty nasty sounding stuff, but that's the role of the midwife in that time. Socrates says the same thing. You ignore me at your peril. And what's the peril? Ignorance. You're going to either, you might come and study with me for a while, but if you decide that, what I'm doing for you as your philosophical midwife, that it's not worthwhile, you'll have a good chance of lapsing back in your ignorance or going off to another teacher that Socrates says is not good for you, learning the wrong stuff, or getting in even you could end up in even worse shape. So ignorance, destruction of your mental faculties, all kinds of things. You ignore your midwife or your philosophical midwife, Socrates, you do so at your peril. So there's 7 rough similarities that shape the analogy between midwives and Socrates, the midwife, the philosophical midwife. A couple of dissimilarities now, so some differences. Where does the analogy break down? Well, it is similar here. I mean, some of these are not all that different than even some of the similarities. But midwives were once fertile, so they did go through that process. Socrates is always claiming he's ignorant. Take that with a grain of salt. There's a little bit of a rhetorical flourish here. But Socrates is really trying to drive home the point that he's not trying to put ideas in anyone. That's not really education. Education isn't just stuffing heads full of things, right? It's not just to put ideas in a person's head. It's to pull out what's already there and help refine it and give it a healthy birth. And pull out what's there, and if it's wrong or bad, you get rid of it. So it's helping to shape the individual, not create the individual. Midwives deal with women and bodies, like physical bodies. They're dealing with the females in the society, and those females, their bodies and what's going on in their bodies while they're pregnant and about to give birth. So there's a physical nature here, and Socrates says, I don't do that. And it's very clear here, Socrates says, I deal with men, and I deal with ideas. So it's important to keep in mind that there's a value judgment going on down here as well, because Socrates says clearly, for him, that's more important. So he says, I do something that is actually analogous, but it differs in terms of its level of importance, because I'm working with the men and I'm working with ideas. That is more important than what midwives do, despite all the similarities. Okay, so just a couple of general comments. So some scholars have said that really what's going on here, as I mentioned, is that all this talk about you don't give birth, no wisdom, all these things. What we should be reading as going on under this is this doctrine of anamnesis. And this is, as I said, a metaphysical epistemological doctrine. Roughly, there's been tons of literature on what anamnesis is about. But this anamnesis is a doctrine that learning is really recollection. So to learn, when you learn something, in the deep sense, what it is, it's a kind of recall. So what's important in learning is that you're recalling, you're recollecting, it's a memory. So not in the everyday sense that, every time you learn something, it's completely just memory. No, but the really important concepts, like concepts of number and space and time and all these kinds of things, the real deep concepts that we have, and according to the doctrine of anamnesis, these are not concepts that we learn through experience. These are concepts that we bring to ordinary experience. Now, you might be thinking, okay, if I have concepts in my head that I bring to experience that I don't learn through experience, like I learned the concept of cat through experience. Yeah, Plato has no problems with that. But a concept like number or time or things like that, Plato's saying in the doctrine of anamnesis and other places in his dialogues, that you don't learn that through experience. So is that what's really going on? Is this Socrates is really using all this to illustrate a doctrine? And in that sense, we should be reading this in a deep metaphysical way, talking about that. There is some evidence towards the end of the dialogue, and we'll see it a little later in other videos, that might be kind of what's going on. So this might be a foreshadowing of later position that Plato is going to have Socrates articulate towards the end of the dialogue. So it's good to keep this in mind, get this sort of into your head, what's going on here, and see how it resonates or relates to later discussions in the dialogue. Or think of it, as I've mentioned in previous discussions, from a simple methodological, pedagogical point. Think of who Socrates is talking to here. Socrates is talking to Theaetetus. Remember the context. Remember this drama that's unfolding here. You might say, no, all that fancy metaphysics, and that's not what's going on here. You could say something like this. Socrates is talking to a kid. Theaetetus is young. Remember, he's only about 16. He's a smart kid, precocious and all that. He's like a ship with good ballast. He's upright. He can sail and sail along without being sort of skittish and all that, like other young people, says Socrates. So what this really should just be seen as is this is just methodology. This is like how I'm going to do things. Don't get mad when I try to help you with things, when I claim I'm ignorant, but at the same time I'm going to take away your bad ideas. Try not to resent me. Don't ignore me, Theaetetus, or you'll get into trouble. And what we're doing here is really, really important, right? I'm trying to help you give birth to the ideas that are in you, but don't worry too much about the origins of those ideas. Don't get trapped in all the metaphysics. This is just basically an educational point. So sometimes you hear, if you study education, the Socratic method. What's that? Well, the Socratic method of teaching is you just ask students questions and you force them to think about things rather than trying to lecture and, put the ideas in their head. You ask them lots of questions. So in that sense, it's just merely a methodological one. Could we see it as that? Yeah. Could we see it as a deeper dive into metaphysics? Yes. There's evidence for both. And of course, we could say, well, maybe that's what both things are going on here. It's an examination of methodology and a deeper reflection of an epistemological, metaphysical position. So, scholarly literature, you can go and take a deep dive into this. There are different ways to interpret this. Some people want to push for this. Some people want to push for that. So, in general, there's no clear consensus on the fact, other than it's important to the dialogue, but exactly how to interpret it in the context of the dialogue, mere methodology or metaphysical doctrine, well, it's still a matter of discussion. See you next video.